Comfort. Ryan jerked his chin toward the old sofa. Should have kept your husband. The words lingered like frost in the room. Helen blinked, not because of the cold light filtering through the thin curtains, but because the voice, so clipped, so final, echoed a night she had tried to forget. The same voice that had handed her a pen across the kitchen table 3 months ago, the night she quietly signed her name on the divorce papers and sealed away 38 years of marriage. She turned back to the pot on the stove, forcing herself to focus on the bubbling broth. The scent of ginger and chicken rose weakly into the air, but it could not warm the silence pressing down between them. The apartment, too modern and too small, felt tighter today. Ryan leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. He hadn't looked at her since the remark. He didn't need to. I added carrots, Helen said gently, placing the bowls on the table. The way you liked when you were little. Ryan didn't respond. He sat, picked up his spoon, and ate without a word. Leslie passed by from the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She smiled, perfunctory. Don't work too hard, Helen. Retirement is supposed to be restful. Helen managed a polite nod. I haven't officially retired. Leslie gave a quick, amused laugh, then vanished into the bedroom. Dinner continued with the sound of spoons and the quiet drone of a distant TV. Helen glanced at the walls, no photos. The apartment was sterile, even though it bore the name home. Later, she opened the drawer by the kitchen and paused. There, tucked among the coupons and scattered envelopes, was a folded document. Her name stood out on the page, a formal notice. The title, Transfer of Ownership. The apartment had once been registered under Ryan and Helen, jointly a temporary arrangement until the divorce finalized. Now everything was in Ryan's name. She folded the paper back slowly, her fingers trembling. When she turned, Ryan was watching her. Not ashamed, not apologetic, just done. I thought we talked about this, he said. This isn't permanent. I didn't know you made it legal. She answered, voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled, tossing the last of his soup aside. Look, I'm not throwing you out. I'm just saying couch is yours. 1 week. Helen stood still. The spoon in her hand was still warm. Ryan, she began, but he had already turned away. She walked to the living room. The sofa, that same brown, sagging thing her husband used to fall asleep on during Sunday football, stood like a relic. It hadn't aged well. Neither had she, perhaps. Her eyes searched the room. There were no signs of her here. Not the framed wedding photo. Not the chipped blue vase. Not even her old knitting bag. Ryan had cleaned it out like one might clear an old drawer efficiently, quietly, without cruelty, but without care. She sat down on the edge of the couch. The fabric gave a little under her weight. A groan of springs. A memory of a man snoring gently, legs crossed, remote, slipping from hand. Now it was just a place to sleep for someone who no longer belonged. She looked toward the window. The evening snow had started again, brushing white onto the thin glass. A city she barely recognized waited beyond. She reached for her coat, folded neatly on the armrest. She looked at the sofa one last time, the couch that had once held warmth, now just an afterthought. She didn't know where to go. Helen's mother's old garage is deep behind the gas station. Dusty cold, but all she has left. She had once told Ryan, half laughing, I used to sleep there when I was little. Remember? He hadn't replied. Maybe he didn't remember. Or maybe he just didn't care. Either way, she was here now, her footsteps echoing slightly against the damp concrete as she unlocked the side door. The garage hadn't changed much in the decades since she'd last stepped inside. Damp brick walls, mottled with age and mildew. An old incandescent bulb swung faintly from the ceiling, giving off a weak yellow glow. Cold air seeped in through the cracked wooden panels of the door. The dust hung like a curtain untouched. She wrapped her coat tighter around her and slowly walked the perimeter. Shelves of rusted tools, a broken bicycle, an oil can tipped on its side. In the far corner, a stack of old boxes still sealed with the same masking tape her father used to insist on. She sighed and crouched. The floor was dry at least. She swept out a space near the wall, using an old broom she found leaning behind the shelf. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Cleaning was something to do with her hands, something to delay the wave of realization that this empty, cold garage was now her home. She opened one of the boxes. Inside were faded books, a broken wristwatch, and a thick wool blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar. She held it close to her face, breathing in the years. Beneath the blanket was a small wooden chair with a worn cushion. She pulled it out, placed it near the bulb, and gently lowered herself onto it. Her knees ached, but she was too tired to mind. She folded the blanket twice and draped it over herself. The chair creaked, but it held. A temporary bed, perhaps. Certainly not comfort, but enough. A quiet knock startled her. She rose carefully and opened the door. Standing there, bundled in layers, was Mrs. Gloria, the woman who lived in the small house next door. She was holding a paper bag. "I thought you might need this," Gloria said without smiling. "Bread, still warm." Helen blinked. "Thank you. I thank you." Gloria gave a nod and turned to go, leaving a trail of footprints in the thin layer of dust outside. Helen closed the door gently and placed the bag on the chair. She returned to the boxes. Another one was labeled Mother, Personal. Her breath caught. She peeled back the brittle tape and opened the lid. Inside were carefully arranged letters, photos, and a few trinkets. A lace handkerchief, a broken brooch, an envelope yellowed with time. She lifted it slowly. The handwriting was hers. She frowned. It was a letter she had written years ago, addressed to her mother, never mailed. She unfolded it, eyes scanning the familiar ink, the uneven lines, the pain that spilled into words she had never spoken aloud. In it, she had poured her frustration about the early years of marriage, her loneliness, her longing to return home, this home. She had cried, writing it, then tucked it away, afraid to send it, ashamed of its honesty. At the bottom of the box was a small photo. Ryan, no older than 6 grinning cheeks, smudged with chocolate, standing in front of this very garage. Helen sat again, the blanket on her lap, the letter in her hands. She stared at the flame of the bulb above, imagining how easily the paper would burn. But she didn't move. The photo, the letter, they weren't meant to disappear. Not yet. She folded the letter gently and placed it back in the envelope. She kept it. "I used to be a nurse. I know what a long damaged person looks like," Gloria said. Helen turned slowly from the small window, where the drizzle painted soft lines against the glass. The old kettle on the stove whistled faintly. Outside, the light was thinning into evening, the sky pressed close with a grey weight that felt more like silence than rain. She hadn't planned to let Gloria in, but when the knock came gentle, just 2 taps, and she opened the door to see the older woman holding a small pot wrapped in a towel, something in her softened. Perhaps it was the way Gloria didn't ask. She simply stepped inside, nodded toward the stove, and said, "Soup. Lentils and carrot. It settles the stomach." Now they sat at the cramped wooden table in the corner of the garage-kitchen hybrid, 2 chipped teacups between them. The air smelled of steam and rosemary. Gloria glanced at Helen with that quiet steadiness nurses never quite lose. "You're thinner than last week," she said simply. Helen half smiled. "A week ago I had a home." Gloria stirred her tea, then set the spoon aside. He said that to you, about the sofa. Helen nodded, eyes lowered. Comfort should have kept your husband? That's what he said. Gloria didn't speak for a long moment. Then my father said something like that to my mother once, right before she packed his things and left. Helen blinked. She hadn't expected that. I remember the way she looked. Gloria continued, her voice low, not angry, not hurt, just done. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but old, worn in, like a favorite coat. Helen finally spoke. I thought raising him right meant he'd never say things like that. Sometimes they still do, Gloria said gently, even when we give them everything. The kettle let out a sudden hiss. Helen rose to pour the hot water over the tea bags, then sat again. Her hands trembled slightly. You were a nurse? She asked. Retired 5 years now, Gloria said. Before that, I worked hospice. I took care of your husband once. Did you know that Helen looked up? You cared for Arthur just in the final weeks. Parkinson's is slow but cruel. He used to talk about you. Said you were the only person who knew how to fold his favorite sweater the right way. Helen pressed her lips together, unsure if she wanted to smile or cry. Gloria sipped her tea. Forgive me if this is too forward, but do you still have any property contracts in your name? The question landed like a dropped fork. Helen blinked. I don't know. You might want to check, Gloria said. Men like your son, people like that, they don't wait around before putting things in their name. Helen stared at her cup. Her mind flickered back to papers she had signed in numbness, to meetings where the lawyer had spoken, but the words hadn't truly landed. I haven't looked, she admitted. Not since the divorce. I didn't think now, Gloria said gently. You still have time. After Gloria left the drizzle, still tapping lightly on the tin roof, Helen sat alone in the stillness. The teacups remained warm to the touch. She stood slowly, the floorboards cold beneath her feet, and walked to the wooden cabinet in the far corner of the garage. The bottom drawer creaked as she pulled it open. Dust bloomed upward, soft as breath. Beneath a stack of old recipe books and a wrapped set of silverware she had forgotten she owned, she found it a sealed manila envelope, heavier than she expected. Her name was written across the front in faded ink. She stared at it, fingers resting on the edges. She had forgotten it entirely. Helen gently stroked the yellow envelope where the corner was faded. I forgot I had this. The light had barely crept through the slats in the garage door, brushing gold over dust and wood, warming the cold morning. A kettle clicked softly behind her, releasing the scent of hand-boiled coffee into the quiet air. The envelope sat between her palms, aged, worn, like something waiting for time to catch up with it. Gloria's voice echoed from the day before. There are things we think we've lost, but in fact they've just been pushed into a dark corner. Helen took a slow breath and peeled the flap open. Inside, the paper was delicate edges, browned but still legible. She unfolded it carefully, reading line by line, heart slowing with each word. This document certifies the will of Mr. and Mrs. Alden Harrow. Her eyes skimmed downward. The parcel of land to the north, designated Lot 7B, shall be the sole property of our daughter, Helen Alden Harrow, regardless of marital status. She stared at that sentence, then read it again. Her fingers trembled. She placed the document on the table, pressing the corners flat. The garage's quiet deepened, as though the world itself was holding its breath with her. She closed her eyes and remembered. It was in the 2nd year of her marriage. Gregory had approached her after dinner, leaning casually against the sink as she washed the dishes. Wouldn't it be easier, he'd said, if we merged our names on everything, one clean estate, less paperwork? Helen had looked at him, the sponge dripping in her hand. You mean the land from my parents? Gregory had smiled, but not kindly. It's all just names on paper, Helen. We're married. And yet something in her, quiet and stubborn, had refused. I'd rather keep that part separate, she'd replied. He hadn't argued. But she remembered the silence afterward. The way he had dried his hands too hard on the towel. The way he hadn't looked at her the rest of the evening. She opened her eyes. That conversation, once forgotten, now felt like a wedge. A piece of something larger she hadn't understood. She turned the paper over. The will had been notarized, sealed, copied. This wasn't a rough draft, it was official. And it had remained all these years untouched. She rose and poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands steadier now. As the steam rose, she thought of Ryan. Did he know? Probably not. He had never been interested in family paperwork, just in outcomes. But Leslie was a real estate lawyer. Helen's stomach tightened. She pictured the way Leslie had smiled at her last week. Tone light and pleasant retirement is supposed to be restful. She remembered the neat stack of folders Leslie always carried, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the ease with which Helen had been moved out. Helen returned to the envelope. Beneath the will was another slip, a photocopy of a property map, Lot 7B circled in red ink. She sat for a moment longer, then reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered above a name, Sandra. An old friend, not close, but once in real estate. Someone who might know how to check recent land transfers. She was about to tap the screen when it buzzed. A new message. It was from the local property registrar. A notification. Her land, the land to the north, had just been transferred to Ryan Weston. Helen froze. She looked down at the will in her lap, then back at the glowing screen. Her land was no longer hers. I was planning to throw Ryan a birthday party next week, but... You must be busy, right? Leslie chuckled, her voice flat. Helen paused, her hand tightening slightly around the handle of her basket. The grocery aisle stretched in both directions, lit with a harsh white glow that made every wrinkle feel deeper. The tiled floor beneath her feet felt suddenly colder. The apples in her basket shifted as she adjusted her grip. She hadn't expected to see Leslie here of all places. But there she was, wearing a beige wool coat and soft makeup, as if every movement had been rehearsed. The smile was polite, but not warm. I'm doing fine, Helen replied, the words, even if hollow. Leslie glanced at Gloria, who stood beside Helen with a quiet, alert presence. And how's the neighborhood treating you? Helen nodded. Quiet. I like quiet. Leslie reached into her purse and pulled out a sleek, cream-colored envelope. I just picked up the invitations. Here, take a look. She held it out like a polite offering, but her fingers didn't release it right away. Helen took it slowly. The paper was thick, textured, expensive. Her thumb ran over the embossed gold print. You are invited to celebrate Ryan Weston's 35th birthday, hosted by Leslie and family. Time, date, venue, no mom, no mother, not even Helen. Helen turned the envelope over as if expecting a hidden message. You're inviting me? She asked, quiet. Leslie's lips curled into a half smile. I mean, you saw it now, right? I guess you could stop by. But you know how these things go. He's always surrounded. And with everything you've been dealing with, we thought you might want some space. Helen nodded, her heart thudding like distant thunder. Right. Of course. Leslie glanced at Gloria again, who hadn't said a word. But her eyes were fixed not on Leslie's face, but on her hands. On the way, her fingers curled just a little too tightly around her purse strap. Then Leslie smiled again. Well, we'll see what the week brings. Take care. She turned and walked away. But as she passed a row of shelves, she glanced back just once. Her expression dropped like a curtain being drawn, cold, sharp, unguarded. A flash, no more. But Gloria saw it. Helen remained still. Only when Leslie disappeared behind the freezer section did Gloria speak. "She's removing you," she said quietly, step by step. "I've seen this before, sons married to women like her. It always starts with invitations without names." Helen let out a soft breath. "You think I don't see it?" Gloria touched her arm. "I think you're still hoping it's not true." They walked in silence to the checkout. Outside, the wind had picked up. Gloria offered to carry the bag, but Helen refused. She needed the weight. Back in the garage, the chill had crept in, despite the blanket stuffed at the door. Helen set the groceries down on the table and reached for her purse. She wasn't even sure why. Habit, maybe. Inside was the old birthday letter she had written to Ryan last year, never delivered. The envelope had yellowed slightly. The ink on the front still clear to my son on your birthday. She had written it after a long evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a trembling pen. She remembered the words, "Even if the world forgets, you were once small enough to hold in my arms, I will not." But the letter had stayed in her purse. Ryan had cancelled their lunch that day. Too busy, he'd said. She hadn't tried again. Now she held the letter for a long moment, then set it next to the store-bought invitation, one written in love, the other in erasure. Her disappointment ran deep, like groundwater under cracked earth, quiet, buried, but persistent. She didn't cry. She just stared. And in her eyes, something had shifted. Not broken, but awakened. "Why isn't my name in the land records?" Helen asked, her voice low but firm. The air in Mr. Daniels's office felt too warm for a winter noon. Dust hung in the sunbeams, slicing through the half-closed blinds, catching on leather-bound folders, a dried-out plant on the windowsill, and the shoulders of a woman who had not planned to raise her voice, but might, if pressed. Mr. Daniels looked up from his screen, startled but not surprised. He had aged since she'd last seen him, hair thinner, jowls heavier, but the sharpness in his gaze hadn't dulled. "Let me pull it up," he said, fingers clacking over the keyboard. Helen sat motionless, eyes locked on a framed certificate above his desk. Beside her, Gloria sat with her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but her presence filled the room like an anchor. Daniels leaned forward. "This is the land from your parents, correct Lot 7B under your maiden name." Helen nodded. "Transferred to me 32 years ago. You handled the documentation?" "I remember." He clicked twice more, frowning. "Give me a moment?" "Yes." "Here it is." He turned the monitor slightly. "Current listed owner Ryan Weston." Helen blinked once. "And before that, transfer occurred 5 months ago." His voice slowed. "It shows here the signature of a Helen G. Barlow. Was that you?" Helen leaned in. There it was. Her name. But not her name. The letters were oddly spaced, the G curved too tightly, the B too long. It mimicked her style barely. "No," she said quietly. "I never signed this." Daniels tapped his pen against the desk. "You're sure?" She turned to him, eyes steady. "I remember my handwriting." "Very well." A beat of silence. Daniels straightened in his chair. "Then we have a problem. Forgery is not just unethical, it's criminal." Gloria spoke, her voice calm but edged. "Could we get a copy of the original transfer file?" Daniels nodded. "Absolutely. I'll scan it now." He stood and walked toward the adjoining archive room. The door creaked open, revealing rows of aging binders and a single humming scanner. The scent of old paper and coffee grounds drifted out. Gloria turned to Helen. They did this hoping you wouldn't ask. Helen didn't answer. Her eyes were on the door Daniels had passed through. Her jaw was tight. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, Daniels returned a folder in hand. He laid out the documents carefully, property forms, digital transfer receipts, and the signature page. This is what was submitted to the county, he said. You'll want to take this to a signature verification expert. Helen ran a fingertip over the photocopied page. The imitation was close, but off in the way that would catch only a woman who had spent years writing her son's name on permission slips and doctor forms. Every loop, every angle wrong. Daniels hesitated. There's something else. Helen looked up. 3 months before the transfer, Leslie Weston visited me, asked about old property holdings, family trusts. She was very thorough. She never mentioned me. Helen asked. He shook his head. Not once. Gloria scoffed softly. Of course not. Helen said nothing. She gathered the documents, sliding them carefully into her bag. As she stood, the light from the window caught her face just enough to reveal something new, not grief, not confusion, but clarity. Not the burning kind, the slow kind, the kind that spreads when silence becomes unbearable. She turned to Daniels. Thank you. We'll be in touch. Outside the air bit colder, but she didn't shiver. Her coat wrapped tight, the folder pressed against her ribs. She walked with purpose. At the end of the block, she stopped, opened the folder again, stared at the forgery, and whispered almost to herself, I remember my handwriting. Very well. If you keep up with those little things, Ryan said, eyes unblinking then, you're destroying this family. The roast chicken on Gloria's table had grown cold. Outside the dining room window, the last breath of winter curled against the glass. Inside, silence stretched long after Ryan's voice faded. The fork in Helen's hand hovered just above her plate, a sliver of meat untouched. Gloria, ever composed, reached for the teapot, pouring slowly, her gaze fixed on the liquid, but her ears attuned to every heartbeat in the room. Helen set her fork down. Ryan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed lightly, one leg bouncing underneath the table. He wore a pleasant expression, the kind saved for polite company, except his eyes, which remained tight. I'm destroying it, Helen asked, not raising her voice. By asking questions, Ryan's smile didn't reach his eyes. It's not the questions, it's the tone, the assumptions. Leslie's been feeling pressured. Pressured. Helen repeated the word slowly. You mean nervous? He hesitated. Yes. Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a thin plastic folder. She laid it on the table and slid it across to him. He looked down. The copied land transfer. Her name. Her forged signature. You've seen this before, she asked, calm. Ryan's jaw worked. Leslie handles most of the documents. You didn't sign off on it? I don't know what that is. He replied too quickly. Helen gave a small, tired nod. I see. Gloria placed a napkin in her lap and lifted her tea. She said nothing, but the shift in her breathing was subtle and telling. You're overthinking, Ryan said. You've been under stress. Maybe it's time to slow down. Stop digging. Helen's fingers brushed the cloth napkin in her lap. It was one she'd brought, her old habit. A little linen square she always carried folded precisely even when others found it odd. A remnant of care, of routine, of a time when details mattered. She unfolded it absent-mindedly, now smoothing it flat on her knees. Then looked up. If the signature is verified by experts, she said slowly, and proven false. What are you afraid of? Ryan. His foot stopped bouncing. He said nothing, just stared at the glass of water before him. After a long pause, he said, You need to rest. Think more positively. Helen tilted her head. positively. He pushed back from the table. This isn't helping. I came here to be civil. She watched him gather his coat, then glanced toward Gloria with a thin smile. Thanks for dinner. Tell Helen to call me when she's ready to talk. Calmly. Gloria returned his smile with silence. He left. The front door clicked shut behind him, and with it came a hush so deep it felt like the house exhaled. Helen looked down at her lap. The napkin had slipped. It lay on the floor beside her chair, still folded, undisturbed. She didn't pick it up. Gloria sipped her tea, then said softly, "That's the voice of someone who has chosen sides." Helen didn't answer. She looked toward the front door, where cold air still lingered in the frame, then back at the empty space across the table. Something in her so long suspended between disbelief and hope finally settled. The expert shakes his head. This signature, Helen, is a bad imitation. Helen sat with both hands on her lap, fingers laced. Her coat still held the chill of outside air, though the room was warm and orderly. Neat stacks of folders, softly humming equipment, and a pot of tea cooling on a side table. Mr. Rivers removed his glasses, polished them with the corner of his sleeve, then leaned closer to the projected image on his screen. The signature glared under magnification, every loop, every line exaggerated under digital scrutiny. I've studied handwriting for 30 years, he continued. People can't fake pressure. They forget how ink behaves under muscle memory. This was traced, or copied, by someone mimicking the rhythm, but not the feel. Helen nodded slowly. Gloria sat beside her arms, folded lightly. Her eyes scanned the charts pinned to the wall, sample signatures, pressure studies, baseline comparisons. She said nothing, but her presence, as always, was grounding. Mr. Rivers reached for a thin sheet of transparent acetate. Here, this is a pressure overlay. These strokes are hesitant. See the slight tremble at the base of the B. That's not consistent with someone writing their own name. He tapped the screen with a capped pen. Also, look here. You always end your signature with a low, sweeping tail. This one ends abruptly, no flow, just copied shapes. Helen exhaled, as if letting go of something she hadn't meant to carry this far. And it's legally valid to challenge this, she asked. It's not just valid, Rivers replied, leaning back in his chair. If you didn't authorize this and it transferred property, that's fraud. You'll need to file a report, but first let me prepare a formal opinion letter. Should take me 3 days. Helen nodded. Please do. Gloria leaned forward slightly. Would it help to have other witnesses? People who can verify her signature over the years, Rivers smiled. Always helps. Old bank documents, checks, even birthday cards. If she's consistent, we can build a timeline of patterns. Helen's eyes flicked toward her purse. Inside, she had a checkbook from 2 years ago and letters she had written to her mother, each signed with care, each a quiet act of continuity. Something tugged at her memory. There was a call, she said aloud, voice distant. Gloria turned. What kind of call from the bank? Months ago. A woman said she needed to confirm my identity before releasing some account information, but I never got the follow-up call. She paused, frowning. I thought it was a mistake. Or spam. I didn't think much of it. Mr. Rivers leaned forward. What institution? Helen shook her head. I don't remember exactly, but I remember the tone. Too polite. Too fast. Gloria murmured. It wasn't a confirmation. It was phishing. Helen sat very still. Outside the office, the world moved on a delivery van reversed into the alley. A dog barked twice. A cold breeze scattered leaves near the door. But inside time had narrowed to a point, a realization taking form. They hadn't just excluded her. They'd impersonated her. Used her name, her history, her trust. If they used my identity to cheat, Helen whispered, not to anyone in particular, they broke the law. Her voice didn't shake, and this time she didn't wait for someone to nod in agreement. Helen pulls the cardboard box out of the corner of the closet, dusty, labeled, "Do not open until ready." She didn't remember writing that label, not in her own hand at least, but it was her handwriting. Slightly slanted, a little tired and sharp at the edges, just like the days that had followed Gregory's funeral. Maybe she had written it to herself, or maybe she was just finally hearing what he had always tried to say. The bulb above her flickered faintly, throwing dull yellow light across the worn wooden floor of the back room. This space had once been part of her father's small workshop, now forgotten behind stacks of winter blankets and unclaimed luggage. The air smelled of cedar and dust, but under it all lingered something softer, the faded scent of Gregory's cologne. Helen knelt on the rug, the box resting before her knees. She ran her fingers along the tape brittle, now pulling it slowly until the flap peeled free with a sigh. Inside layers. The first was a scarf, hers deep green, with a small patch sewn where it had once torn. Beneath it, a leather-bound notebook, the kind Gregory always carried. Its edges were frayed, the strap cracked, but when she opened it, the ink was as fresh as breath. She flipped slowly eyes, adjusting to the elegant loops of his cursive. Tuesday. Helen says Leslie's smart. I think she's too sharp, too quiet. She watches more than she speaks. Helen stilled. A few pages further, I'm worried about the land. I told Helen we should make it clear if anything happens, she must have the papers. She swallowed, turning another page. There it was, a folded contract, creased from years of sleep in the dark. She opened it carefully. Gregory's handwriting witnessed by a notary. In the event of divorce, premarital assets remain in Helen G. Barlow's possession. Her name. Clear. Bold. Not forged. The paper trembled slightly in her grip. She laid it down beside the notebook and reached into the box again. Tax receipts faded but legible. Year after year, paid under her name. Land lot 7B. She brushed her fingers across the column of her name, as if making sure it was still there. Near the bottom of the box, tucked beneath a set of envelopes, lay a heavy fountain pen. Gregory's. She lifted it gently. The weight in her hand was familiar and strange. The last time she'd seen him use it, he was sitting at the dining table scribbling a note to the plumber, joking that they should move into the garage and leave the main house to the cats. She hadn't known he was preparing more than repairs. The pen clicked softly as she pressed the cap back on. Helen leaned against the side of the cabinet and pulled the notebook closer. Toward the end of the last entry, his script had faltered, slightly more hurried, but still firm. If anything happens, don't believe everything your son says. The words were clear, not bitter, not angry, just true. She closed the notebook slowly, holding it in both hands. The bulb above her flickered again, then steadied. No sound outside, no Gloria's voice, no soft knock at the door, just silence, thick and honest. Helen sat there for a while, unmoving. Her eyes burned, but her face did not fall. She no longer looked soft. She no longer needed to. Leslie says in front of everyone, "She's not part of this family anymore. She's just my ex-mother-in-law." The silence that followed was clean and sharp, like crystal shattering, but without a sound. Helen held her teacup steady. The china rim trembled slightly against her lip, but her hand did not. Around the long table, the family paused mid-bite, mid-laugh, mid-breath. Forks hovered above plates, wine glasses froze half-raised. The warmth from the fireplace didn't seem to reach the center of the room anymore. The reunion dinner had been Leslie's idea, formally hosted, carefully arranged. A long table candlelight, proper linen napkins, a printed seating chart. Most of the guests were from Gregory's side, aunts, uncles, cousins, old neighbours, whose names Helen hadn't spoken aloud in years. She hadn't been invited directly. Aunt Claire had passed along a polite reminder. They say it would mean a lot if you came. So she did. Helen had chosen her old coat deliberately. Brown tweed repaired at the shoulder buttons slightly mismatched. Gregory once called it her battle armour. She had hung it behind the front door and walked in with her head high. At first it had gone well enough. Leslie performed as hostess with grace. She laughed at appropriate moments, handed out wine complimented Aunt Marian's hair. Ryan stood at her side, nodding, silent. The topic of property arose between bites of roast and sips of Cabernet. Leslie cleared her throat and said sweetly, "Some of you may have heard rumours about the land near the old orchard. There was an incident." Helen's eyes didn't blink. Leslie continued, "Nothing serious, of course. Just a misunderstanding. Some documents, well, things can get tangled with time, especially when people forget what was agreed on." Helen set her teacup down slowly. "My signature," she said, her voice even, was forged. "I have the expert analysis. It's clear." The table fell still. Even the candles flickered smaller. Someone coughed. A child dropped a spoon. Leslie's smile tightened. Then she tilted her head, looked around the table and said lightly, "Well, you all know she's not really part of this family anymore. She's just my ex-mother-in-law." The words landed and stayed. Helen stood. Her chair made no sound against the polished floor. She didn't raise her voice, didn't tremble, didn't glance toward Ryan. She looked at no one and everyone. "I won't argue with anyone here," she said quietly, "but I will wait for you at the courthouse if necessary." She reached for her coat. No one moved to help her, not even Ryan. The buttons were stiff. She fastened them with deliberate care. Her scarf was still tucked in the sleeve, and she looped it around her neck without haste. The room remained frozen. Leslie looked away first. Helen turned toward the hallway. As she passed the coat rack, a voice barely a breath followed her. "Aunt Claire. I'll call you tonight." Helen paused, then nodded once, and walked into the night. Helen tells the lawyer, "I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but I won't stay silent." The words echoed gently in the quiet office, not louder than the ticking of the wall clock, but firmer than any gavel strike. Helen sat with her hands folded neatly on the polished oak table. In front of her, a stack of worn manila folders, documents, photos, letters. Beside them, Gregory's notebook. Closed, but still heavy. Mr. Martinez didn't speak right away. He sat behind his desk, motionless but attentive. One hand gently turning the pages, the other resting atop a small wooden hammer on his left. It wasn't ornamental. It wasn't flashy. Just a simple reminder of his trade worn smooth from years of being held. Black and white photographs lined the walls. Courthouse steps, civil rights marches, moments frozen in legal resolve. This wasn't a place for spectacle. This was a place for facts, for rules, for doing things correctly. Claire had called 2 nights ago, voice hushed, almost apologetic. "He's retired, but still takes a few cases, especially ones that need heart." And Helen had come. She cleared her throat softly. "This is the handwriting analysis from Mr. Rivers." And these, she passed over a clipped set of pages, are tax receipts and the original contract Gregory and I signed years ago. He kept them in a box. Martinez nodded as he received the bundle. His eyes, framed by thin silver glasses, scanned carefully. No rush, no judgment, just rhythm. He paused at the notebook, turning to the last page. He tapped once, then twice gently, before whispering, "If anything happens, don't believe everything your son says." Helen nodded. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Martinez leaned back and said almost as if to himself, "We have a solid case." Helen exhaled quietly. "I'd like to request a stay on any future transactions involving the land," she said, "until we verify what's legal and what's not." Martinez agreed. "You'll need to sign a petition. I'll submit it by the end of the week, and I'll contact the registry office directly." She opened her purse, pulled out a small notepad. "Can you also verify how many assets are currently listed under my name? I want to know what's still mine officially." He nodded again. "Yes. That will take a few days, but I'll include it in the initial request." Helen sat still, watching the sunlight play across the grain of the desk. Her coat, draped on the chair behind her, still carried the scent of cinnamon and dry leaves. Winter was stretching, but spring was no longer just a rumor. Martinez tapped his hammer lightly once against the table. Then he looked up. "Are you ready if everything goes public?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the edge of Gregory's notebook. "I'm not looking for noise," she said finally. "I'm looking for justice." Martinez smiled for the first time. It was small, thoughtful, almost tired. "Then we'll do the right thing, the right way. On the town hall, notice petition for ownership verification. Helen Rivers. Preliminary hearing date." It was printed in clean, bureaucratic font, posted near the public bulletin board by the municipal bench, surrounded by yoga flyers, dog walking services, and missing cat posters. But it drew eyes and whispers. Helen didn't pause when she saw it. She only slowed, slightly adjusted the scarf at her neck, and continued toward the corner grocery with her cloth bag swinging gently at her side. The bell above the door chimed the same tired note it always had. Inside, the scent of onions and floor cleaner hung in the air. People moved about as they always did, only quieter today. Not because of her, she told herself, because of the cold. But the glances didn't lie. From behind the fruit display, Mrs. Green's lips pressed thin as paper. Two young women by the dairy fridge leaned in and whispered. A child looked up at Helen and asked, "Is that the lady from the paper?" before being quickly hushed. She smiled at the grocer, who pretended not to notice the change in the air. "Cold morning," Helen said. He nodded. "Colder than usual." She picked out her usual items, milk crackers, a single apple, and placed them gently on the counter. As the man weighed the apple, his eyes flicked upward. "So, court business, huh?" he said, trying for casual. "Big deal." Helen met his gaze. "It's not a big thing, just something that needs to be corrected." He nodded, murmured right, and finished the transaction. Outside, the frost had begun to melt under a pale sun. As she stepped away from the door, a voice called gently after her. "Helen." She turned. An older woman stood near the bench. Her cane leaned against her coat, her grey curls tucked beneath a knitted hat. "I read the notice," the woman said. Her voice was soft kind. "I was in your shoes once. Long ago." Helen hesitated. The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Don't let them silence you. Some truths, they need to speak, even if it shakes the ground." Helen's throat tightened. She gave a small nod. "Thank you." They didn't exchange names, just glances from one survivor to another. Back at home, a letter was waiting in the mailbox, thick, official, sealed in crisp cream paper. Helen opened it at the kitchen table. The court had scheduled a formal hearing. She would have to appear. The date was 3 weeks away. She set the letter beside her radio and washed the porcelain teacup, one she hadn't used in months. Gregory had bought it for her one autumn, just because she liked the soft blue line along its rim. She filled it with hot water and Earl Grey. Then she sat by the window. The sun cut low across the empty field. The frost glittered in patches where the shadows hadn't lifted. The radio clicked on automatically at 10 a.m., as it always did. Next on the regional update, the host's voice rang out a civil case filed this week by Helen Rivers, 62, challenging a property title transfer involving her son and daughter-in-law. A preliminary hearing has been scheduled. Helen didn't flinch. She brought the cup to her lips, inhaled the familiar scent of bergamot, and let the warmth gather inside her. Her hand reached slowly for the photo frame on the windowsill. Gregory in his garden hat, smiling crookedly, eyes squinting from sun and laughter. "You wouldn't be silent if you were me, would you?" she whispered. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone. In the courtroom, Helen speaks for the first time. "I've lived long enough to know when a man is lying." The wooden benches creaked as a few townspeople shifted in their seats, unsure where to look. The room was small, but the air was heavy. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the town hall courtroom, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything felt slow and intentional, like time itself had taken a seat to listen. Judge Green, white-haired and unreadable behind his half-moon glasses, nodded once. "Please proceed." Attorney Martinez stood, his grey tie slightly crooked, his hands calm. "Your Honor, we are here to examine the legitimacy of a property transfer that removed Mrs. Helen Rivers's name from land records without her knowledge or consent." He gestured toward the documents stacked beside him. "We will show that the signature used in the transaction was not hers. We will present a timeline of events demonstrating coercion, deception, and isolation." Helen sat quietly beside him, her hands folded. Her glasses rested on the table unused. Her eyes were focused, steady. Ryan sat across the aisle, arms crossed, lips thin. Leslie leaned forward, her posture rigid, her dress too crisp for the setting. She scanned the room with restless eyes. Martinez called Helen to the stand. The room stilled. She rose slowly but firmly, took the oath with a clear voice, and sat. "I'm not here to blame," she began, "but I am here to tell the truth. And I've lived long enough to know when a man or a woman is lying." A murmur passed through the back row. "I was married for 38 years. My husband and I built that property together. After his passing, I remained the legal co-owner until 5 months ago, when I discovered accidentally that I was no longer on the documents." She paused. "My son and his wife told me it was for convenience. But no one asked me. No one explained. I was asked to stay quiet, to be grateful." Her hands were calm on her lap. Martinez stepped forward again. "Mrs. Rivers, are you aware of this signature?" She turned to the screen, where a blown-up signature was displayed. "That's not mine," she said simply. "The G, I never curl it that way, and I don't put a loop on the R in Rivers." Martinez nodded. "Let's compare it to her official tax filing from the previous year." Another signature appeared. The contrast was obvious, one fluid familiar, the other clumsy, over-embellished. Leslie shifted. "That's hers," Martinez said quietly, pointing to the older signature. "That's not." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Understood." Leslie stood. "Your Honor, with respect," she signed that form willingly. "She may not remember. She's not been well. We only acted to help manage the estate efficiently." Martinez raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Helen did not flinch. "I remember everything," she said. "And what I don't remember, I write down." She placed Gregory's notebook gently on the table. The courtroom didn't need to read it to feel its weight. Ryan hadn't spoken, not once. Leslie turned to him, leaning close. Her whisper, though hushed, was sharp and urgent. "If you don't say anything, they'll take everything from us." Helen didn't look away. She simply reached for her glasses, placed them slowly back on her face, and stared straight at her son. She had spoken, and she would not be silent again. Martinez places a piece of paper on the table. This is a letter from Mr. Gregory Rivers, sealed 3 years ago. The courtroom was quieter than ever. No shuffling, no murmurs, just the weight of those words hanging in the air like dust that refused to settle. Helen blinked slowly. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The room seemed smaller now, drawn tight around the edges of the paper lying untouched on the table. Judge Green adjusted his glasses. Who presented this from the back row? Aunt Claire stood, her hands trembling slightly. Your Honor? I was instructed to deliver this only if things went wrong. Gregory gave it to me 3 years ago. Ryan turned sharply. You had a letter from my father all this time. Claire didn't flinch. I was told to wait. And now is the time. She stepped forward, placed the sealed envelope into the judge's hand with careful reverence. The old woman's eyes briefly met Helen's. There was sorrow there, but also strength. The judge nodded and broke the seal. Inside was a single page, yellowing but neat. The handwriting was unmistakably Gregory's loops-wide slant, deliberate, a little shakier than before, but still unmistakable. Martinez was the one to read it aloud. To whom it may concern. If this letter is being read, I am no longer present to speak for myself. Let this serve as record of my intentions. All properties currently co-owned with my wife, Helen Rivers, are to remain under her sole name in the event of my death. I do not wish for our son, Ryan, or his spouse to interfere with this arrangement. Helen has stood by me through every storm. This is my wish, written without pressure and of sound mind. Gregory Rivers. Helen closed her eyes. She had not expected this, had not even dared to hope. It wasn't the legal weight of the letter that made her breath catch, but the line, Helen has stood by me through every storm. It was quiet again, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Judge Green looked up. Does the defense contest the handwriting? Leslie shifted. We weren't aware of any letter. This could have been written without legal counsel. Martinez stepped forward. Your Honor, we also have handwriting verification reports matching this letter with Gregory Rivers's previous statements and financial forms. There is no indication of coercion. This was entrusted to a third party, not found conveniently by the plaintiff. The judge held up a hand. Ryan stood abruptly. He never said this to me. He never said he didn't want me involved. I'm his son. Claire's voice cut through the air, low but firm. That's because he knew what you were becoming. Ryan opened his mouth, then sat back down. Helen didn't speak. She couldn't. The tears had started quietly, unannounced. She dabbed them away with a tissue from her sleeve. She wasn't crying out of victory. She was crying because her husband had trusted her through to the very end. Judge Green looked down at the letter one more time, then announced, "The court will continue to investigate the alleged forgery and asset manipulation. For now, all affected assets are to be frozen and restored temporarily to the name of Helen Rivers until the investigation concludes." The words didn't echo, but they landed hard. Leslie looked pale. Ryan stared straight ahead, unblinking. Helen exhaled slowly. Not in triumph, in relief, like a storm had passed. Outside the courtroom, the sun had come out too bright, almost unfamiliar. As she stepped into the light, a young man in a grey coat stepped toward her with a recorder. "Mrs. Rivers," he said gently. "Is there anything you would like to say?" Helen stands in the middle of the living room, looking at the armchair, where Gregory used to sit every night. Now it is empty, but peaceful. Dust floated through the morning light, like old stories suspended in the air. The windows cracked open for the first time in months, let in the scent of wet earth and new leaves. Helen stood in the center of the room, her eyes tracing the quiet outlines of her life furniture covered in white cloths, picture frames, tilted books still resting where they were last touched. The armchair, Gregory's chair, sat by the window. The same cushion he used, slightly dipped on the right side, still held its shape. But now, instead of sorrow, the sight brought stillness. She did not speak. She did not need to. Claire moved gently around her sweeping cobwebs from the corners, folding covers, wiping down forgotten surfaces. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer condolences. Just presence and silence that knew how to listen. In the kitchen, the old kettle hissed softly. Spring had arrived. Not with blossoms or birdsong, but with light through clean windows and the scent of lemons from a freshly wiped table. Claire paused, holding something between her fingers. "He gave me this," once she said. "Years ago. Told me not to bring it out unless you needed it. It was an envelope, thicker than the others." Helen recognized Gregory's handwriting before even touching it. She didn't reach for it. "I believe he did enough," she said, folding a dry towel. "The rest is mine." Claire nodded and quietly slid the envelope into a drawer. No insistence, no ceremony. Footsteps echoed outside. A lighter rhythm unexpected. Emma appeared at the door, pink cheeks and ponytail loose in the breeze. She was holding something. "I found this in your closet," she said shyly, holding out the deep green scarf Helen used to wear every winter. "You used to wrap it around my head like a turban," the girl added, giggling. Helen smiled, kneeling down and slowly wrapping the scarf around Emma's small shoulders. "Are you still angry with Dad?" Emma asked. Helen paused. The question did not pierce it, landed softly like a leaf on water. She didn't answer. Just pressed her hands gently around the scarf, then kissed Emma's forehead. Later that afternoon, when the house had quieted again, Helen sat at the small writing desk beside Gregory's armchair. She pulled out a sheet of cream paper. The ink moved slowly under her hand. "To the person who forgot me, but I still remember who you are. I still remember what you loved to eat, how you looked when you were afraid, and how small your hands were the first time I held them. That will never belong to the court." She folded the letter and placed it in the bottom drawer beneath a pile of old receipts and forgotten birthday cards. No name on the envelope, no intention to send it. Night fell gently. Claire had gone home. Emma had dozed off on the sofa, still wrapped in green wool. Helen turned off the lamps one by one, letting the moonlight fill the room. Then, just before she locked the front door, something caught her eye through the lace curtain. A figure, standing outside the fence, still, unmoving. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the figure turned and walked away. Helen didn't chase it. She didn't need to. She closed the curtain. Then sat in Gregory's chair, not to grieve, but simply to rest. "I have nothing left to prove. Not to anyone, not for anyone. Just to live on properly." A cool breeze moved through the backyard, rustling the sprouting leaves of the old apple tree. It had stood there for decades, quiet through storms, patient through winters. Now tiny buds unfurled again, as if to whisper life continues. Helen knelt on the soft ground sleeves, rolled gloved hands, gently patting down the soil around a transplanted herb. Behind her, the kitchen door creaked open, and the scent of fresh apple pie drifted through. Claire stepped out, holding the dish like a ritual offering. "Thought this weather deserved it," she said. Helen wiped her hands on her apron, nodding with a grateful smile. "It does." On the wooden table under the tree, Emma flipped through a book, her legs tucked up beneath her eyes, scanning slowly, lips moving without sound. She didn't ask questions anymore. She didn't need to. The world had adjusted to this new rhythm. Inside the house, Helen had started reopening her small pottery shop quietly. No announcement, no online presence, except for a simple listing with no profile photo. The orders were modest. A teacup here, a small vase there. Just enough. One of the requests was for an antique teacup with floral carvings. Helen wrapped it, carefully slipped in a short note. "Thank you for remembering me." That morning, a plain envelope had arrived, no message, no apology, just the transfer documents signed and stamped. Ryan's handwriting on the final line. Helen read it once, folded it quietly, and placed it into a drawer without a label. Later, she found herself by the fireplace. She held a photo, her wedding photo edges, curled colours faded. No tears, no tightness in the throat. She let it go into the flames. It curled inward, turned sepia, and disappeared. Not with anger. Just farewell. The scarf, Emma's favourite green one, rested on the back of the chair. It had been there since morning. "Are you happy now?" Grandma Emma asked without looking up. Helen poured the tea slowly, letting the steam rise between them like a soft veil. She smiled a smile without edges. "Yes," she said, "and that's enough." The breeze lifted again, tugging at the edge of the scarf. It slipped off the chair, fluttered once, and drifted down onto the wooden steps. Helen saw it. She didn't rush. She just sat, her hands wrapped around the teacup, her gaze somewhere beyond the tree, beyond the fence, beyond the need to be seen. And the wind moved on, soft, unburdened like her. In the end, Helen didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek revenge. She chose something quieter and stronger to stand, to remember, and to reclaim. Piece by piece, she restored her name not only in documents, but in her own reflection. Justice may come late, but it does arrive. And sometimes the most powerful answer to betrayal is dignity that endures. The chair remains empty, no longer painful, just peacefully vacant.